Have you ever kept a habit alive just because someone you loved used to do it? Even after they were gone. Every evening at 5 o'clock, a golden retriever named Daisy walked to the front gate of a small house in Ohio and sat down. She didn't bark, she didn't whine. She just sat, ears up, eyes fixed on the empty road, waiting for a truck that was never coming back. Margaret would watch her from the kitchen window, dish towel in her hands, throat tight, and she never once called her back inside. Because Frank used to come home at exactly 5 o'clock, every single day for 31 years, and somehow, some way, Daisy still remembered. 2 years had passed since the funeral, 2 years of empty driveways and cold coffee, and a silence in the house so loud it rang in her ears. But that dog at that gate was the only thing that still felt like Frank was almost home. And on an ordinary Tuesday evening, with rain clouds rolling in low over the fields, a stranger's car sputtered and died right in front of that gate. And Daisy did something that would change everything. The house sat at the end of Miller's Creek Road, white paint peeling at the corners, a porch swing that hadn't moved in 2 years because Frank was the one who used to sit in it. Margaret Hensley was 68 years old, and some mornings she'd woke up and forgot, just for a second, that he was gone. She'd roll over expecting the warmth of him, expecting the sound of him breathing, and then the truth would land on her chest like a stone dropped from a great height. Frank had been a quiet man, the kind who said, "I love you," by fixing the leaky faucet before she even mentioned it, the kind who whistled old country songs while he worked in the garage. He'd driven a delivery route for 31 years, and every single day, rain or shine, he'd pull into that driveway at 5 o'clock sharp, and Daisy would be waiting at the gate to greet him first. It had become a kind of sacred rhythm in their lives, one Margaret never thought much about until it was the only piece of him left. He died on a Thursday morning in March, heart failure, sudden and cruel and final, and by that evening Margaret was a widow and Daisy was a dog who didn't understand why the truck never came. Nobody warned her that grief would look like a golden retriever sitting patiently by a rusted gate, still keeping a promise the world had already broken. Daisy had come into their lives 8 years earlier as a wriggling, clumsy puppy that Frank brought home in a cardboard box, grinning like a boy who'd gotten away with something. Margaret had scolded him for not asking first, but one look at those big brown eyes and she was done arguing. Frank named her Daisy because she reminded him of the wildflowers that grew along their fence line every spring, stubborn things that came back no matter how hard the winter had been. From the very first week, Daisy attached herself to Frank like a shadow. She rode in his truck to the end of the driveway some mornings, just to feel the wind on her face before hopping out. She slept at the foot of their bed, but always on his side, and every single evening, without ever being trained to do it, she would trot to the front gate around 4:45 and wait, tail sweeping slow across the gravel, until his truck rounded the bend. Margaret used to tease him that the dog loved him more than she did. Frank would just laugh and say, "Well, I never once left her waiting." It was a joke between them for years, until the day it wasn't funny anymore, until the day the truck came home without him in it, driven instead by a coworker with red eyes and shaking hands, and Daisy ran to the gate anyway, because nobody had told her the rules had changed. In the weeks after the funeral, Margaret tried everything to break the habit, because watching it broke her heart fresh every single day. She tried keeping Daisy inside at 5 o'clock, distracting her with treats, with toys, with long walks time to keep her busy and away from that gate. Nothing worked. Daisy would scratch at the door, whimper low in her throat, and the moment Margaret gave in, She'd bolt straight for that spot in the gravel like her whole body was pulled there by something stronger than obedience. So Margaret stopped fighting it. She let her go. Every evening, rain or shine or bitter Ohio snow, Daisy sat at that gate for exactly as long as it would have taken Frank's truck to round the bend. And then, when it never came, she'd walk back to the porch with her head low and lie down with a sigh so human it made Margaret cry into her dish towel more nights than she could count. The neighbors noticed too. Old Mr. Kowalski next door said it gave him chills the first few times he saw it, that dog sitting so still, so certain, staring down an empty road like she still believed in something the rest of them had buried. But over time it became just part of the evening on Miller's Creek Road. The sun sinking low, and a golden retriever keeping a vigil nobody had the heart to end. Margaret's days had shrunk down to small, manageable pieces after Frank died. Feed Daisy, water the garden, answer the phone when her daughter called from 2 states away, asking if she was eating enough. Her daughter Carol had begged her to move into a smaller place in town, closer to her, closer to people. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to leave the house Frank had built with his own 2 hands. The garage where his tools still hung exactly where he'd left them. The gate where his dog still waited. Loneliness had a texture to it that Margaret hadn't understood until she lived inside it. The particular silence of a house built for 2 people, now holding only 1. The way meals felt pointless to cook for just herself. The way she'd sometimes talk out loud just to hear a human voice in the rooms. Daisy became more than a pet in those months. She became the only living thing that understood the shape of what Margaret had lost, because she was grieving the exact same man in her own quiet, 4-legged way. They ate dinner together at the same time every night. They walked the same path Frank used to walk. And every evening, they kept his habit alive at that gate, together, as if loyalty itself could hold a door open for a man who was never walking through it again. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray afternoon that smelled like rain and wet leaves and wood smoke drifting from someone's chimney down the road. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard it. The low, unmistakable sputter of an engine dying, followed by silence, right outside her fence. She looked out the window and saw a beat up sedan stalled crooked in the road, hazard lights blinking weak against the coming dusk, and a man climbing out of the driver's seat looking lost and a little embarrassed, running a hand through gray hair as he popped the hood. Margaret almost didn't think twice about it. Cars broke down on that road every so often, and folks around here always stopped to help. But before she could even reach for her coat, Daisy was already moving. Margaret watched, stunned, as her dog trotted straight past the porch, past the mailbox, and right up to the stranger at the gate, nearly 2 hours before her usual 5 o'clock vigil even began. Daisy nudged the man's hand with her nose, once, then again, more insistent, and when he crouched down to pet her out of pure reflex, she grabbed the sleeve of his jacket gently in her teeth and began to pull. Not aggressive, not scared, pulling the way she used to pull Frank's pant leg toward supper when he lingered too long in the garage. The man laughed, confused, glancing toward the house, and that was the moment Margaret stepped out onto the porch, heart hammering for reasons she couldn't yet explain. She almost called Daisy back, almost apologized for her dog making a spectacle of a stranger's bad luck. But something in the man's face stopped her cold. He was maybe 70, with kind, tired eyes, and the particular slump of shoulders she recognized from her own mirror. The posture of someone who had been carrying grief so long it had reshaped his spine. "I'm sorry," he called out, still smiling faintly at the dog now leaning her whole body weight against his leg. Car just died on me. Didn't mean to make a scene. Margaret came down the porch steps slower than she meant to, her mind snagging on something she couldn't name yet. She's never done that, Margaret said, nodding at Daisy. Not to a stranger. Not ever. The man looked down at the dog like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, and something passed over his face, a flicker of memory, or maybe recognition of a loneliness matching his own. I lost my wife 18 months ago, he said quietly, like the words had been sitting in his chest for a long time, waiting for somewhere safe to land. Had a dog just like this one, growing up. Haven't been able to look at one since. Margaret felt her own eyes sting without warning. She invited him in out of the rain, mostly for the sake of the storm rolling closer, but partly because Daisy would not stop pulling at his sleeve, insistent, as though she had been waiting for this exact man to arrive. His name was Walter, and he sat at Margaret's kitchen table drinking coffee he clearly didn't need, but was too polite to refuse, while his tow truck was still an hour out. Daisy lay across his feet under the table the entire time, a weight Margaret hadn't seen her offer to anyone since Frank died. They talked the way two lonely people talk when they finally find someone who understands the specific shape of their grief without needing it explained. Not about the weather, not small talk, but about the terrible strangeness of sleeping alone in a bed built for two, about grocery shopping for one person and always buying too much out of habit, about the phone calls from grown children who worried but lived too far away to really help. Walter's wife had been named Ruth, and he talked about her the way Margaret still talked about Frank, present tense slipping in without meaning to. She makes the best, instead of, she made, because some part of you never quite finishes the sentence in the past tense. Margaret found herself telling him about the gate, about Daisy's 5 o'clock vigil, about how she'd never had the heart to break a habit that felt like the last living piece of her husband. Walter listened without a single trace of pity in his face, just understanding, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before he said, maybe she wasn't just waiting for him all this time. Maybe she was waiting for whoever needed finding next. Margaret couldn't answer that. She just sat there with her coffee going cold, watching her dog sleep soundly across a stranger's feet, feeling something in her chest loosen for the first time in 2 years. Not replacing the grief, never that, but making just a little room beside it. The tow truck came an hour later, headlights sweeping across the kitchen window, and Walter stood reluctantly, thanking her for the coffee, for the shelter from the rain, for the strangest, warmest hour he'd spent since Ruth passed. At the door he crouched down one more time and pressed his forehead gently to Daisy's, the way you'd greet an old friend rather than a dog you'd met an hour ago. Thank you, he told her, and his voice cracked just slightly on the words. Margaret stood on the porch and watched his car get towed away, watched Walter climb into the passenger seat of the tow truck and wave once through the window, and she felt the strange, hollow ache of hoping, actually hoping, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. She didn't let herself want it too badly, but that night, when 5 o'clock came and went and Daisy walked to the gate out of pure old habit, Margaret noticed something different in the way her dog sat there, less like waiting, and more like remembering something good. 3 days passed, and Margaret told herself it didn't matter, that a stranger's broken down car was just a strange, small moment in an otherwise empty week. But she found herself glancing at the gate more than usual, found herself hoping every time a car engine sounded on the road. She hated herself a little for it, for wanting something, anything, after 2 years of wanting nothing but Frank back. Daisy, meanwhile, had gone back to her regular vigil, but there was a restlessness in her now, a way she'd glance down the road even outside her usual hour, ears perked at every distant engine. On the fourth day, it rained hard enough to flood the low part of the road, and Margaret sat by the window watching the water rise, thinking of nothing in particular, when she saw a familiar sedan, freshly repaired, paint newly washed, pull carefully up to her gate. Her heart did something it hadn't done in years, a small stupid leap she immediately tried to talk herself out of. Daisy was already at the door before Margaret even stood up, tail beating so hard against the wall it rattled a picture frame, and when Margaret opened the door, there was Walter, standing in the rain with a bag of dog treats in one hand like an offering, looking as nervous as a teenager. "I know this is forward," he said, water dripping off the brim of his cap, "but I couldn't stop thinking about your dog, and about you, and I figured, a man my age doesn't have the luxury of waiting around to see if a good thing happens twice." Margaret stood in the doorway with her heart pounding, in a way she thought had died along with Frank, and she looked down at Daisy, who was already leaning her whole weight against Walter's leg, like she'd claimed him days ago, and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "Come in before you catch your death," Margaret finally said, and her voice shook only a little. That evening turned into a habit of its own. Walter coming by most days that week, sitting at the kitchen table, walking with Margaret and Daisy down the same path Frank used to walk, never once trying to replace what she'd lost, only ever trying to sit quietly beside it. Margaret found herself laughing for the first time in 2 years, a real laugh, surprised out of her by something small Walter said about his terrible cooking, and the sound of it in her own empty kitchen startled her almost as much as it startled Daisy, who lifted her head from the floor to look at her owner, like she too had forgotten what that sound was. But grief doesn't let go so easily, and one evening, sitting across from Walter at her own kitchen table, Margaret felt the guilt rise up in her chest like floodwater she couldn't hold back. "I feel like I'm betraying him," she admitted quietly, staring down at her hands. "Like laughing again, like letting someone else sit in this kitchen, means I've stopped loving him." Walter didn't rush to comfort her, didn't offer easy words. He just reached across the table, careful, and let his hand rest near hers without quite touching it, giving her room to decide. "Ruth used to say," he said slowly, "that love isn't a cup that empties out when you pour some of it somewhere new. She said it's more like a well. The more you draw from it, the more it fills back up." Margaret cried then, the kind of crying that had been building behind a dam for 2 solid years. And Walter simply sat with her, letting her grieve out loud for the first time since the funeral, not trying to fix it, just being present in the wreckage of it. Daisy climbed up onto the chair beside Margaret, resting her head heavy in her lap, and for a long while the only sounds in the kitchen were rain on the roof and a woman finally letting herself feel everything she'd been holding in alone. The lowest point came 2 weeks later, when Margaret woke in the night to Daisy's frantic barking from downstairs, sharp and desperate in a way she'd never heard before. She found her old dog collapsed near the gate in the porch light, breathing shallow and fast, having clearly tried to make her nightly vigil despite legs that had grown stiffer with age than Margaret wanted to admit. The vet's office wouldn't open for hours, and Margaret sat on the cold porch floor, holding her dog's head in her lap, terrified in a way that felt achingly familiar, the same helpless terror she'd felt the morning Frank didn't wake up. She called Walter without even thinking about the hour, and he was there within 20 minutes, gravel crunching under his tires in the dark, already dressed, already moving. Together they got Daisy into his car and drove to the emergency animal clinic 40 minutes away. Margaret in the back seat with her dog's head cradled against her thigh, whispering to her the entire ride, "Not you too. Please, not you too." Walter drove faster than he probably should have, jaw tight, glancing in the mirror every few seconds to check on them both. And Margaret realized somewhere on that dark highway that she was terrified not just of losing Daisy, but of losing the last living thread connecting her to Frank, and losing it right as she'd finally started to breathe again. The vet kept Daisy overnight running tests, murmuring words like heart and age and "well, no more" by morning, and Margaret sat in the waiting room chair, unable to sleep, unable to eat the sandwich Walter quietly placed in her hands. He didn't leave. He sat beside her through the whole long night, not filling the silence with empty comfort, just being there, solid and present, the way Frank used to be during hard nights, the way Ruth had probably once been for him. Around 3 in the morning, Margaret finally spoke what she'd been turning over in her mind for hours. She waited at that gate for 2 years for a man who was never coming back. She said, staring at the sterile clinic floor, "And now I'm terrified she's going to leave me the same way he did. Sudden and gone. And I never got to say the thing I needed to say." Walter took her hand this time, fully, no hesitation, and held it while she shook. "She's not done yet," he said quietly. "That dog's still got waiting left in her. I can feel it." Margaret wanted so badly to believe him, but fear had a way of drowning out hope, and she spent the rest of that night bargaining silently with a God she wasn't sure was listening, promising anything, everything, if Daisy could just open her eyes one more time. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, and every so often a technician would walk past with a clipboard, and Margaret's whole body would tense, bracing for news she wasn't ready to hear. She thought about all the years Daisy had spent faithfully sitting at that gate, asking nothing in return, and it felt suddenly, unbearably unfair that the dog who had given so much loyalty might not get to keep receiving it. Walter brought her a second cup of coffee she didn't ask for and didn't touch, and at one point, without a word, he simply moved his chair an inch closer to hers, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that she could lean if she needed to. She did eventually, around 4 in the morning, when exhaustion finally outweighed her pride, and she rested her head against his shoulder and let herself be held up by someone else's strength for the first time in 2 long years. Neither of them said much during those final dark hours before dawn. There wasn't much left to say. There was only the waiting, the same kind of waiting Daisy had taught them both. Patient and aching and full of a hope neither of them wanted to name out loud in case naming it made the disappointment worse. Morning came slow and gray, and the vet walked out with a tired, gentle smile that told Margaret everything before he even spoke. "She's a tough old girl," he said. "Enlarged heart, some arrhythmia, comes with age. She'll need medication, and she'll need to slow down, but she's going to be okay." Margaret's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Walter caught her elbow, steady, the way he'd been steady through the whole terrible night. When they finally brought Daisy out, groggy but wagging her tail weakly at the sight of them both, Margaret pressed her face into her dog's fur and cried harder than she had at the funeral, because this grief had an ending she could survive, and that made all the difference. On the drive home, Daisy resting quiet in the back seat, Margaret watched the sunrise pink and gold over the wet fields, and something in her chest shifted. Not healed, grief never fully heals, but rearranged, like furniture moved to let the light in differently. She looked over at Walter's tired, kind profile behind the wheel and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that Daisy hadn't just been waiting for Frank at that gate all those years. She'd been keeping a door open, and doors, once open, let more than one person through. The vet had warned them Daisy needed rest, needed her routine slowed down, and Margaret worried terribly about what that meant for the ritual at the gate, the last piece of Frank she couldn't bear to lose. But that evening, at 5 o'clock sharp, Daisy rose stiffly from her bed by the fire and made her way to the gate anyway. Slower now, more careful, but every bit as certain. Margaret followed her out, wrapped in Frank's old flannel jacket against the evening chill, and Walter came too, standing a respectful few feet back. Understanding this was sacred ground, he hadn't earned the right to stand fully inside yet. They watched together as Daisy settled into her spot in the gravel, ears up, eyes on the empty road, keeping the same vigil she'd kept for 2 years. But this time, when the vigil ended and no truck came around the bend, Daisy didn't walk back to the porch with her head low the way she used to. She turned instead toward Walter, tail sweeping slow across the gravel, and pressed her graying head against his leg, as if to say the waiting had finally led somewhere after all, as if two kinds of loyalty had quietly become one. Margaret stood on that porch and felt Frank's absence, the way she always did, a permanent ache stitched into her ribs that would never fully disappear, and she understood something in that moment she hadn't let herself understand before. That loving someone new didn't erase him, didn't dishonor him, didn't close the door on 31 years of marriage. It simply meant that love, real love, the kind Frank had taught her by coming home at 5 o'clock every single day without fail, was too strong a thing to die with just one person. It had taught her dog to wait faithfully for 2 long years. And in the end, it had taught that same dog to recognize another lonely, grieving heart standing stalled at her gate, and to pull him in out of the rain. Walter moved slowly into their lives over the following months, never rushing, never replacing, simply adding warmth to a house that had been cold too long. He fixed the porch swing that had sat frozen since Frank's death, and the first evening he sat on it beside Margaret. Daisy climbed up between them, resting her graying head on both their laps at once, keeping watch over her whole-heeled family as the sun went down gold over Miller's Creek Road. There are still hard days. There are still mornings Margaret wakes and reaches for a man who isn't there. Still evenings the empty side of the closet catches her off guard. Grief doesn't leave just because life adds something good back in. It simply learns to sit at the same table, quieter than before. But she has stopped feeling guilty about the quiet joy that has crept back into her days, the sound of 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, the porch swing moving again under new weight. Margaret often thinks now about how strange grace is, how it rarely arrives the way you expect it to, how it drove up in a broken-down sedan on an ordinary gray Tuesday, and nearly got waved off as bad luck. She thinks about all the evenings she almost broke her dog's habit at the gate, almost decided the waiting was too painful to witness, and she is endlessly grateful she let it continue, because loyalty like that, it turns out, isn't really about the past at all. It's about keeping a door open long enough for whoever needs to walk through it next. Daisy still goes to that gate every evening at 5 o'clock. Slower now, gray around her muzzle, and some nights Walter walks out with her, and some nights it's just Margaret, and every night it is still, in its own quiet way, an act of faith. She used to think her dog was waiting for a man who was never coming home. Now she understands Daisy was simply keeping love alive until it was ready to arrive in a different shape. And if there's one thing Margaret wants people to understand about what happened at that gate. It's this: sometimes the thing you think is breaking your heart is actually the thing quietly mending it, one ordinary evening at a time. So tell me, has an animal in your life ever seemed to understand your grief better than the people around you did? And do you believe, like Margaret does now, that love finds its way back to us in shapes we never expect? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story touched something in you, if you believe in the kind of loyalty that waits at a gate for 2 years and never gives up hope, hit that subscribe button, because we bring you a new story like this one in every single video, made to remind you that you are never as alone as you feel, and that an animal's love really might be one of the purest things on this earth.